It was obvious from the very outset, you know, with the script and the way it was and how many sets there were, that it was going to be important to have someone who could give you great design and build great sets in a very short amount of time. The film got going really quickly. We were going to have a very short pre-production period. Owen did like an amazing job, as he did like on the Matrix films.
There's about 89 set areas that we have, or location areas that we have in the film. Some of them have 4 or 5 parts to them. It's a lot of things you've either got to find or build. And we've had a very limited amount of pre-production.
When we first started, you know, the first thing that happened was we were sort of trailing through Europe looking for a place to make the film, I guess, you know. It became apparent really quickly that we couldn't shoot in London, you know, because there wasn't enough time, not enough stage space. So we started on a tour of Europe.
Berlin just happened. We went from Budapest to Prague to Berlin, and as it turned out, the studios were suddenly available and all of their workforce were available.
All the interiors for the film are being shot here in Babelsberg Studios in Berlin. And the challenge for us really is to build, you know, English, London sort of interiors, and we've shot a little on location in Germany, finding German locations, Berlin locations that convincingly match for London.
Well, it's been really great to be in Berlin. The studio is amazing, and obviously there's like a great film history here. And a not so great film history here, because, you know, these where a lot of Hitler's propaganda films were made as well. It's also an interesting place to make a movie like this, because they've experienced so many different oppressive regimes in this city. It's heavy with history here, so it gives so much sort of weight to what we're doing. You could make a version of this film in England, which would be a great way of doing it. But we weren't going to make that sort of film. We were going to make a more manufactured version, I guess.
You would start eventually to see. Well, you'd start, but it's quite a ways back before the fence apples.
We have gone away from certain things which were design styles, if you like, of the graphic novel, which work as a piece of art. But in this instance, I think we have tried to take a measure of London. When people look at it and say, wow, I can see this London, I can recognise it. I think James wanted a sense of earthiness that London has, a grittiness, a sense of London that is very recognisable, as London is today, or as it would have been even 20 years ago, but also a London that you feel a lot would be around in another 20 years' time, particularly in a world that's been kind of frozen by England becoming a totalitarian state.
You don't really know where you are in terms of time. It's as though sort of creativity is almost stopped in a way. So a lot of the interiors, a lot of the dressing is very much today, or even slightly retro in a way. James always sort of pulled back from doing a sort of futuristic look.
We used a lot of greys and grey tones, and all the furniture kind of blended into one sort of particular tone. Plenty of things to have, but they're primarily all the same. And it just made it slightly more regimented. And then adding our sort of our Big Brother look with maybe some telegraph poles with speakers on and cameras everywhere and that sort of thing.
We've gone for very, very real kind of finishes and textures, and, you know, the colours are very kind of muted. We've paid particular attention to the ageing and the kind of the grain and this kind of visceral texture of the film.
Whether it was like people's homes or that, it was, you know, like the feeling of London, if you like. You know, we had a lot of English crews, so that always kept us very, you know, honest as to, you know, what was truly London or what was truly, you know, English-centric, I suppose.
It looks a lot like our world, but in their production design, Owen was able to give it a feel that was a little off. It is definitely the future of our world.
It's been a fascinating film as far as dressing is concerned because there's been so much of it. Every set has been in its own little complex way, but obviously the biggest one has got to be the shadow gallery where V lives.
I remember sitting down and saying to Owen, you know, like it'd be great, you know, if in some ways this was like an expanded ace of clubs, if you like, and you know, there'd always be like a central piece, and then there'd be V's dressing room or V's kitchen or V's reading room. If it could all sort of spiral out from the middle.
It's a cross between a crypt and an undercroft, and I see it as it's the sort of thing that would be almost below St Paul's or underneath Westminster Cathedral or underneath the Old Bailey itself or underneath the law courts in London. It's a kind of Tudor arched space that you could almost imagine 30 years ago they bricked up a door and they forgot it was there.
I thought it should be very dark and with patches of light. Never thought I'd like him to live in sort of perpetual kind of 24-hour light, you know, that he should sort of make a day and a night for himself, and I would do that through the lighting.
He has this eclectic mix of fantastic art that, you know, he's taken and is caretaking, as he says, in his sort of labyrinth of galleries, and we've had to get everything from, you know, Picasso's to Turner's to modern art, comics, toys, all sorts of things, all sorts of really interesting and sort of, you know, great paraphernalia of stuff.
That room is filled with books that were banned by the government, which is hilarious because I don't know where they got the books from, but a lot of them are like, you know, like Jackie Collins or like Posh Spice Tell-All or whatever. So they're not exactly books you'd consider the government opposing so much.
James described it that, you know, V would collect some books and he would put them in this room, and then he'd collect a few more and put them in and keep putting them in and keep putting them in. And so at the far end, it's almost like a snowdrift of books that come up. The hardest thing really is the sort of logistics of then shooting something like that. So you can't just all pile books up because James will say, right, well, let's have that wall taken away. So it would take too long then to take the wall away and then take all the books away piece by piece. So many of them are stuck and screwed together, so they're almost like building blocks.
I suspect there are a number of people in this world of V for Vendetta who are like him, who have their own hoards, their own treasure troves, and the Shadow Gallery is very much a treasure trove.
James brought in a cutout from the newspaper of an old library they had found in Iraq. It looked exactly like the set, just, you know, piles and piles and piles of books that the government had like shut down this library, and it was just sort of incredible having real life parallel.
Voila!
The extravagant outfit that he sports is a Guy Fawkes outfit. Guy Fawkes was a character who was caught underneath Parliament in 1604 trying to blow up Parliament.
V was based in the 16th century but made modern or futuristic in a kind of historical way. So he kept in mind all the kind of stuff that was around at the time of Guy Fawkes and then just chiseled it all down to being quite simple. I'm quite obsessive about the way doublets look, which is made of a kind of basket weave silk, which is an original 16th century weave. And I didn't want there to be all this kind of stuffiness about it, but also I wanted to be very clean, and we had a lot of problems making his body look very neat, because you always get this wrinkle, and James wanted a very kind of neat, clean, beautiful, sexy look. So that, making a doublet do all the things we wanted to was quite difficult.
His mask is a cross between how Guy Fawkes was and a Harlequin mask. It's part of his, you know, actorly vaudevillian behaviour to wear this mask, you know, which hides how horribly disfigured he is underneath.
It's very interesting when every time the mask is drawn in the comic book, it's a drawing, it's slightly different. It can take on different moods very easily. And we went through a number of, probably 6 or 7 generations of carving the mask. We have a very fine sculptor here at Babelsberg called Burnt, who did a lot of work on that. And it's carved in clay to start with to get the personality, then it's cast in fiberglass, and then it's painted.
I thought if the mask was good enough and you thought about how the voice would come out and how you lit the mask, that you would be able to humanise the mask. You could almost look through the mask and see the person in there.
For me, it's been a matter of trying to animate the mask, make the mask work, make the character work through the mask. And so it's a matter of working with James and working with the DP and trying to make the mask work.
What he's been able to do is, you know, make peace with the mask, because it, you know, can be very sort of claustrophobic.
It's got very narrow field of vision. You can't see beyond a point there, and you can't see below here, and you cannot see above there. So you're really looking here, and the costume has a very high neck, and that restricts your head movement. And so there are all sorts of elements with the hat and the wig that I really couldn't get used to until I got onto set. So I just trusted that things would happen.
Exterior sets. Now that's quite interesting because in our world, we're almost de-dressing. We're taking colour away. I think we're going to get rid of sort of some of the big, more sort of corporate advertising. You know, make it more state-run.
This is a model of Trafalgar Square. It was made to sort of plan and coordinate and show the London authorities what we were going to shoot, where we were going to put our lights and stage the action. It's one of the busiest and most well-known and loved landmarks in London.
Every department had to say exactly what they needed by the 30th of March. How many Klieg lights, how many barriers, how the soldiers were being dressed, what weapons they were carrying.
We're standing in Whitehall. The government has blockaded the street, got shutters on the windows protecting it from a possible attack on the actual Parliament and on Whitehall itself. So there are some armoured personnel vehicles, some jeeps and trucks that have brought people on.
Relax, looking ahead.
Shooting anywhere in London, particularly around government buildings, is a very tricky and political event. It involved perhaps 30 different organisations and government bodies. And of course we have to understand and respect that it's a very sensitive area, security-wise and politically.
Really the thing is that the movements in every area need to be known by everybody so that they can be foretold to the people doing the day-by-day security here.
We've managed to sort of pull off quite a coup really to get permission to shoot what we need to shoot and to close down Trafalgar Square, Parliament Square and Whitehall for 3 consecutive nights. It's probably taken five months to set these 3 nights of filming up.
The big sort of visual effects challenges here are blowing things up, which I have to say is a lot of fun. So, and we're, rather than building things on a huge scale, we build what we call miniatures, even though they're still quite large, and blow those up instead. It means you can control the lighting of them and the staging of the pyrotechnics and everything in a studio. And we build them to a scale that is workable, but also large enough that looks realistic.
I've always been of the opinion that if the budget can afford it, you should always do things as big as the budget will allow for a start. The Old Bailey we're building at 7th scale, so that equates to about a 20-foot high model. We also have a 42-foot run of the side elevation of Parliament, which is the miniature you see behind me.
Big Ben is a very, very big piece. It's about 30 feet high. There's an awful lot of weight.
The difference on this is that we're not just interested in what it looks like externally. We also have to take into account the actual construction internally as well, because they're not being built to last, they're being built to break up. Most of it is built-in plaster. Plaster breaks up well and behaves more like stone.
One would normally build a model, much stronger carcass behind the model. You would build it in timber, you would clad it in whatever material would be best suited for the job. It would be painted and it would be designed for close scrutiny and it would be fairly straightforward.
The other thing is that with pyrotechnics, we're shooting at very high frame rates and we need good depth of field. So the bigger we make the models, the more distance we can get between the camera and the model. A lot of the explosives we're using react very quickly as well, so things are moving through frame very fast. So you need to give yourself a bit of room to be able to capture all that.
I'm finished. I'm glad of it.
Don't say that.
I told you only truth.
I guess in some ways, I've known Alan for such a long time, we do have like a shorthand in some ways, And so it was a very easy kind of process.
It's been very busy. Everybody's given 110% in all departments. It's not just set dressing or design or art direction, costume. Everybody's in the same boat.
There are a lot of places, a lot of characters, a lot of things that need to happen to, drive the narrative along. And, there are a lot of sets and we've just had to get through it.
Even though it is set slightly in the future, I think that, things probably won't have changed that much, and I'm excited to sort of like bring that to the screen and see how, if you are complacent or if society becomes complacent, where things can lead.
V for Vendetta is based on a graphic novel that was created in the early 80s. It was an English graphic novel done by Alan Moore and David Lloyd, and it was a really beautiful piece of art.
I, like God, do not play with dice and do not believe in coincidence. You may call me V.
V for Vendetta is in a class of its own. It's a brilliant piece of work. It's a commentary on society, and in the time that it was written, there was absolutely nothing being done like that.
Nobody had seen a character like that before. That sort of long hair and that funny mask and the hat. That was the strangest, weirdest character.
I was really impressed by its literacy, if I can put it that way, by the fact that, the hero V quotes Shakespeare and Bacon and Marlowe and has a marvellous, zestful use of language.
V was very unusual, and it was the first time I was aware of the phrase graphic novel. I had never really heard that before. And the graphic novel is immense.
It was so incredibly dense.
It really has raised the bar for the entire field and moved comics to a different place in the American popular culture.
And I think everybody was really excited by it. Everybody loved that story.
During the 1950s, there was really not much going on in comics outside of regular superhero, standard comics, aimed for an average male teenage reader.
Comics had a perception for a long time. They were viewed as junk. They really didn't have that much of a credibility. They were sort of viewed as just simply throwaway stuff for kids.
The guys who were drawing comics up to that point, it was a job. In the 30s and the 40s, if you could get into illustrating for Saturday Evening Post or something, those guys were stars. Rockwell was a star, Langdecker, all these guys. And the guys that couldn't quite break that market, they'd get into comics. But they would never say what they were doing. They'd go, I work in advertising or something like that.
American comics in the 1950s got a great deal of societal pressure and were accused of being responsible for juvenile delinquency, pretty much anything that was wrong in America at that time. And the way the publishers survived this pressure, they formed a self-regulating Comics Magazine Association of America.
All the work had to be read by the Comics Code authorities and approved by them and get their stamp of approval.
Create a little postage stamp. The Comics Code has approved this comic. Essentially said, this comic is safe for kids. By about 25 years into its existence from the mid-50s, the code had really started to not serve much of a purpose anymore.
We went through a period in the 70s that were very counterculture influenced, very cosmic. A lot of inner journeys and psychedelic comics that were still working in the superhero genre. In the 80s, things started to get grim and gritty.
I think Neil Gaiman used to say, pow, zam, socko. What's that? That's the sound of comic books trying to grow up. We were very proud of what we did. We were proud of the medium. We were going to try to have it be something bigger than what we were being defined as.
The only way you could actually do something interesting in mainstream comics back then was to take a character nobody cared about and say, yeah, go ahead, do whatever, turn him into a frog, do whatever you want. We don't care. Nobody's reading this thing anyway. I mean, I'm amazed the most popular characters now are all the ones that we used to make fun of.
I guess there was a kind of snowballing of real sort of creative talent from the beginning of the 80s and towards the middle of the 80s.
British comics in the early to mid 80s didn't center around superheroes, which American comics did. That's all really American comics knew.
It was an incredibly fertile, wonderful, exploratory time where everyone in the business, we felt, wow, I mean, comics can do so much more and say so much more.
It was a unique moment where really there was this flood of new talent coming into this old established house. Some of the things, like V for Vendetta, were being published by smaller upstart companies that were more fragile.
I was working at the British division of Marvel Comics with an editor called Des Skin. Des left Marvel and set up his own magazine, Warrior. He asked me to create something. And so that's basically how V happened. The original idea was that I write and draw it. But the guy called Alan Moore, who's a very successful writer now, was on board at Warrior at the time.
It really wasn't until Alan Moore came along in British comics, particularly on V for Vendetta in the early 80s, that comics started to turn around. But only if you were aware could you really see that something was happening.
Alan's work was some of the first important creative work that was really done radically outside by a major publisher.
He was one of the first people who decided, well, if I'm going to write comics, I'm going to write for myself, and I'm going to write for readers like myself, and there's no reason why it needs to be a children's medium.
Alan was writing, in a way, almost like novels. He laid out an incredible tapestry of intersecting lines and layer upon layer of ramifications and character development.
Just how elusive his writing was. That blew everybody away.
I thought it was a very good idea that Alan write this new character, because there was no way that I would have been able to introduce something that had the kind of depth that V ended up with.
There was also a very fertile political time in terms of what was being done. Comics felt like we were trying to break them out of a ghetto of perception.
The British comic writers of that period were very politicized. A lot of that was finding its way into the science fiction stories in particular that these guys were writing.
We wanted to do something that was not set in an old world. So the idea of setting it in the future England, where we could create any kind of background that we wanted because nobody knew what it would look like, seemed like an ideal situation. And then setting up some kind of tyranny, a dictatorship that was running the country, gave him a system to fight against.
They were projecting a world ahead and either saying it'll be utopian, dystopian, something in between.
The whole philosophy behind the story was partly stimulated because, you know, this was during the Margaret Thatcher era. It was an ultra-conservative government which was imposing quite heavy political rules on everyone.
The comic book was a political thriller. I mean, but it was a comic book with a superhero. V is a superhero. He's an aberrant superhero, but he is a superhero.
The original plan was for it to be a kind of urban guerrilla, and Alan really wanted something more theatrical. We came up with the idea of Guy Fawkes. So Guy Fawkes was a kind of early anarchist and a saboteur, and it seemed like a good idea to actually model character on Guy Fawkes. Now, we created this story in the middle of summer, so there were no Guy Fawkes masks around, and I couldn't get one, and I didn't know where to find one, so I had to create one. And the thing about these Guy Fawkes masks is that they have a kind of eerie look. They have a look of a smile to them, and it made the character look bizarre and threatening at the same time, because the last thing you really expect from somebody who's coming to kill you is that he'd be smiling. From a visual point of view, I was concerned that a lot of people weren't reading comics who could read comics if they were given a chance to appreciate them in a different way. Sound effects is one thing. You know, wham, pow, zap, all that stuff. We're all familiar with that through the old Batman TV show, and it's become a cliche. And if you're intelligent enough, you know that if a gun's going off, you don't need bang. You can actually just show the fact that it's being shot.
When I first read it, it was like this, this old-fashioned comic in the future. It was weird, and it was very modernist. I mean, it didn't have thought bubbles. It was all in captions. It was a really beautiful piece of art.
I was always concerned about thought balloons. You know, people saying, I think I'll do this now. I thought it was a good idea to make comics more like cinema and more like TV. And we're not aware of thought balloons in cinema and TV. And so he'd run it as a narrative in the background, and that happened very early on.
One of the unique qualities of V for Vendetta is the level of discipline that the creators chose to work under.
When I'd worked for other companies, I'd used big frames and then small frames, and I'd used open frames and stuff like that. A lot of the conventional things you can use in a comic. But that again, any kind of splashy layout in a comic will immediately put off people who don't usually read comic books. And again, that rectangle gives us the relationship with movies and TV.
And it was a black and white comic book. I mean, it's like a 30s movie. I mean, these were incredibly complex and interesting artwork. So to get a hold of them and read them was fascinating. And I thought they were literally storyboards for great movies.
There's a very film noir quality about David's artwork, absolutely.
In terms of the actual visual style of the actual artwork, it was going to be a very stark, bleak future that we were telling a story about. So the obvious thing to do was to use a very stark, bleak style.
It's a real retro future look to David's artwork. I think David's influence as an artist is from real classic British comic strip artists. It's not a comic booky look. He draws real people, and he's got a great graphic sense, a great sense of black and white.
Black and white art in comics can be extremely stark and evocative, and it tends to transport you more into almost a world that connects to editorial cartooning. You feel sort of the raw cartoon line much more in black and white than you do in color sometimes.
The original was in black and white, and people have asked me, about that, because a lot of people prefer it in black and white. I think the thing is that the reason why we did it in black and white originally was because that was all the printer could afford. The publisher could not afford to produce a colour book. If he had been able to, we would have used colour. I would have used colour. I would have liked nothing better than to use colour. I think everybody was really excited by it. Everybody loved that story. We were getting college kids and girls were reading this. We were actually getting people who didn't read comics reading them. So it was like a complete endorsement of the policy that we started out with. And then after 26 issues it finished. We hadn't finished the story, so it was stuck in a kind of limbo.
The magazine folded, and they were never able to do the last act of the book.
There was a part of it that was written, and there was a long break, and then it was like the, sort of greatest cliffhanger in graphic novel history, I suppose.
There was nothing we could do about it. We both found other things to do while we looked for a way of finishing it. towards the middle of the 80s, DC came over and invited a lot of us to come and work for them. They'd seen what we were doing in Warrior, they'd seen what the British creators were doing in 2000 AD, so they said, yeah, there's a bunch of really interesting, talented guys here and they're not really being looked after and we could use them for our books.
Karen came down the hall with some issues of Warrior where fragments of it had been published, and we were doing most of the American publishing of Alan's work by that time. She said, here's an opportunity to finish a story that was started, and why don't we take this on and make this something important?
I remember Alan was writing the end of Watchmen while he was writing the last new issues of V. So the profile in V for Vendetta was pretty high, again because of Watchmen and because of Swamp Thing. So people ate it up, as they should. It's an amazing piece of work.
They did a very good job on it. It was finished and it's become very successful. So, we're happy that things turned out the way they did.
What I respect most about V for Vendetta is the completeness of its vision. The creative talent built their own scenario for what would happen in the world, what the dangers of that would be, and tied it together to history, politics, a specific geography, and really worked all the details together. There's a thoroughness to it that is extraordinary.
The nature of the hero V is a sort of reborn Guy Fawkes. And to American audiences, Guy Fawkes probably doesn't mean much.
In the English imagination, Guy Fawkes is a Catholic terrorist who attempted to blow up the Houses of Parliament, and every 5th of November, because he failed to blow up the Houses of Parliament, his effigy is burnt.
Remember the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. It's been really, really cool as a learning experience, preparing for this project, reading about the gunpowder plot and reading all the histories and all the things that we reference in the script. The gunpowder plot was in 1605, and the Catholics were being really oppressed in England.
Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, and she ruled England for 45 years, or very close to 45 years. In that time, her relationship with the English Catholics, of course, changed.
Elizabeth herself is well aware that she is living and governing in a Europe which is divided between Catholic and Protestant, in which Catholic and Protestant powers are at war. She tries to appeal to as many different religious groups as she possibly can. What I think really causes problems is that the Pope in 1570 excommunicates Elizabeth and declares that her Catholic subjects need no longer obey her.
Elizabeth began to persecute the Catholics with the recusancy laws. She began to take away their lands. She began to prosecute them for holding Mass.
Recusancy laws were laws which invoked punishment for those who did not attend services of the established Protestant Church in England.
Everyone within England is worried by the fact the Queen's not married. Almost the first rule of any sovereign is to make sure there is a guaranteed succession. Without a succession, you can't be certain of what's going to happen in the future. In a sense, she doesn't look further than her own lifetime. Indeed, she doesn't name James VI of Scotland as her successor until she's on her deathbed.
James VI of Scotland was, of course, a Protestant. We should never forget that. But he was also the son of the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots. And as such, he could almost present himself as being all things to all men. The Catholics in England, desperate as they were looking for some relief from James, and they built hopes on some very vague assurances that he gave their representatives before 1603.
So you have this Catholic community who believe now that, okay, James is going to become King of England and he's going to grant toleration to everybody and everything's going to be a lot better than it is now. Things do change to some degree.
When James comes to the throne, he suspends enforcement of the recusancy laws. But then James and his government sit down and have to face priorities. They have to see where the bedrock of their support actually lies, and it actually lies in the Protestant establishment. He says that the recusancy laws are in force, they will be enforced. People have to exercise bare conformity.
Only a tiny, tiny minority of people actually want to take action against these policies. They are the zealots, if you like. Once laws have been created by Parliament and endorsed by the sovereign, people tend to obey it. So in order to change things, you need to really change the policy itself, and that means you need to change the people who make the policy. And the way to do that is to change the sovereign. The so-called gunpowder plot really should be called the Catesby plot, because he's the person who dreamed it up, he's the person who brought people in, and it's his vision that this plot represents.
He was, from by all accounts, he was a very charismatic person. He was highly intelligent. He was also a man who was very much a Catholic.
To my mind, I don't think Catesby had any hopes of James. Catesby is actually motivated by something much more fundamental, a desire for revenge. Revenge on a state which has let him down and let his family down over decades.
He is the person behind the choice of Guy Fawkes. And I think a lot of the timing is to do with the feeling that unless they act at that point, they're never going to see a Catholic England.
Catesby's plan was very simple. It was to stage a military coup, and the first strike in the military coup was to be the destruction of the House of Lords at the state opening of Parliament, when everyone who was anyone in Jacobean England would have been present in that small, crowded chamber. The king, the queen, the king's eldest son, the nobles, the bishops, the leading gentlemen of the shires.
You have a lot of the English Catholics who over the last 15 years or so, because of the recusancy laws and the persecution that had gone on in England under Elizabeth, had almost exiled themselves to Europe to go and fight under the King of Spain's flag, and Guy Fawkes was one of them.
Fawkes is brought in by Robert Catesby's sidekick, Thomas Winter. He meets Fawkes, he talks to Fawkes, he tells them that something is being planned in England, and would he like to be a part of it? Fawkes says yes. Originally, the plotters planned to tunnel under the foundations of Westminster, and to that end they rented a house adjacent to the House of Lords. Unfortunately, they found the going hard. The foundations of Westminster, the medieval foundations, were very, very thick. Luck turned in their favour. A ground floor vault, cellar, directly under the House of Lords was being vacated, and they decided that this would be where they stacked the gunpowder. It was Guy Fawkes' job to pose as the servant of the man who had taken the lease. The plot was given away through an anonymous warning letter to a Catholic nobleman, Lord Monteagle. He immediately took the letter to the court.
The evening of the 4th of November, they searched the cellars of Parliament House and they discovered Guy Fawkes waiting there ready for Parliament to sit the following day to set off the train of powder and blow the government buildings up. Well, of course, he was captured, he was interrogated, he was sent to the Tower of London. Finally, on the 7th of November, he cracked and he started to name some of those that were involved along with him. Those that were captured were taken back to the Tower of London, they were tried and the foregone conclusion, and they were executed.
He was, to some degree, the expendable one, the man with the expertise. So he went into the danger zone. And of course, ultimately, that's why he's the one who's arrested.
The British have celebrated, in that peculiar British way that we have, the attempt to blow up Parliament on the 5th of November, which was the date of the plot, by burning Guy Fawkes in effigy on a huge bonfire and sending up fireworks. It's known as Fireworks Night or Guy Fawkes Night. And children traditionally make their own guy, which is a sort of made out of pillowcases and bits of straw, whatever you happen to have in hand. You wheel it round shouting penny for the guy, and adults give you money. And with the money, you buy the fireworks, you build your big bonfire on any piece of common land, a heath, a garden, you know, public park, whatever.
I saw once in a pub in the north of Ireland a placard behind the bar which said, "Guy Fawkes, the only man to enter the Houses of Parliament with honest intentions." We have a very different perspective on this, historical perspective on Guy Fawkes than English people would have.
I think that the continuing celebration of Gunpowder Plot, the strength of the celebrations, is part of that enduring British wish to defy authority, to, if you like, cock a snook at the government.
You're never told what would have happened if they had blown up the Houses of Parliament. And I think it's unfortunate because a lot of people now have a distorted picture as to what that event really means. I believe that if the Monteagle letter had not been received, I'm almost certain that it would have succeeded.
In all likelihood, nothing much would have changed apart from the fact that England would have had to find a new king. The chances are that Protestant England would have risen against them. There would have been a bloody civil war, and in all probability, the plotters would have been defeated.
What I think perhaps we underestimate is how much mystery still surrounds the plot, because those people like Catesby died without ever giving a confession, without ever giving evidence. There is still a lot about their motives in detail that died with them.
We were always aware that there was a possibility of there being a movie of V. That was part of the deal of selling rights to DC. It was an idea that could be transposed. We didn't have a sort of pure concept of it. Oh no, this is just a comic, blah blah blah. My only expectation and desire of any adaptation that I've been involved in is that it's good.
The Wachowski brothers wrote the first draft in the mid-90s, before we made The Matrix. It followed very closely the novel, and it was very dense, and it didn't have what the current movie has.
Start, you'd be framed here, camera left would be framed here, like down through him.
I was the assistant director on the Matrix films, and to live in the Matrix world is to know the graphic novel world. Larry and Andy are big fans of graphic novels, so I remember on my birthday, actually, Larry and Andy gave me a present and they said, "Hey, have you read this, V for Vendetta?" And they said, "Well, what do you think about us producing it and you directing it?" And I said, "Well, that sounds like it could be good."
There is a stream of graphic novels, a thread of them, which are adult and sophisticated and regarded by aficionados as full literature. And since meeting James, I have read the original V for Vendetta, and I have to say I admire it enormously. It's a remarkable piece of work.
Whereas a graphic novel was written as like a thinly veiled kind of allegory about the Thatcherite period, and it was written in the 80s. And, the backstory was set in the 80s, and then the current story of the novel was set in the 90s. We thought it might be good to make the backstory in the 90s and project it into the future a bit. In an adaptation, I guess, there's always things that you're going to have to leave out and, put in, take out. So we tried to, condense it and make the graphic novel more filmic.
The graphic novel is immense, and it would require many hours of movie to kind of explain it all. The Wachowski brothers viewed this story from a little different angle. They focused more on the V-Evie relationship.
It challenged things, concepts that you might be comfortable with already, that you might have set ideas about certain issues in your mind already, and this sort of attacks those, and I was just really excited by it.
There was a couple of things that we wanted to address. One, which was the Evie character, who in the graphic novel is sort of this blonde-haired young girl, bit of a cipher, I guess. We thought it would be better to make her a little more intelligent, a little more, have a little more smarts, not just be such a pawn of V.
Usually with action films based on graphic novels, you don't really get the sense of thought behind it that you find in this script. And so I read it and I was just so excited by it.
It is a graphic novel. It's done slightly differently to how you have to make a film. There has to be a certain sort of other level on a film, a certain level of kind of reality.
Of course it's tricky. It's not entirely realistic. It's not meant to be. So that's what I find interesting about it, because I'm sort of one has seen so much of realism. It's good to be working on something that has a certain heightened quality to it.
Fucking hell. The graphic novel itself was drawn in a very cinematic way, and when it was done, it broke with convention, broke with, thought balloons and, word balloons. You could see when David Lloyd was actually drawing it, some of the frames are very cinematic.
I'm happy to see see the silver screen now in a very good version.
Who was he?
He was at Vendetta's, and he was my father, and my mother, my brother, my friend.
I think it's a political thriller, first and foremost. It is in the superhero genre, but it's also a play on that convention.
It is an action film, and it does have a lot of action elements, but it isn't a pure action film. There's a lot of ideas that take it above that. I mean, it's a strange world.
Who is but the form following the function of what? And what I am is a man in a mask.
The world in V for Vendetta is that it has become a one-party state, a fascist state.
It's a police state, basically, where a very malign government is attempting to create a world where ethnic minorities are disenfranchised and not just marginalized, but used as experimental material.
There isn't much of the world left, and what is left, England seems to be sort of on top. There isn't. The United States is virtually wiped out, it seems.
Society is now ruled by government, rather than the government sort of being run as a voice of the people. It's sort of, in some ways, flipped around.
There's a kind of tradition of these films, which I love. It's one of the reasons I took this job on, was because I always adored films like Logan's Run and Zardoz and Fahrenheit 451 and The Omega Man and Soylent Green. Dystopic movies, they used to be called. Movies set in a bleak future in which, the heroes choose freedom over the oppression of the current time. And that kind of film's rather disappeared from mainstream cinema for years and years and years, and it's rather good to have it back.
There are, of course, those who do not want us to speak.
I suspect right now orders are being shouted at the phones and men with guns will soon be on their way.
It's more like 1984 meets Alien, if you want to do one of those modern meetings, than it is Orwellian in that sense. It's borrowed a bit from Orwell.
I think the satire, which is clearly abundant in the film. I mean, it is a film which pulls no punches in its satire against authoritarianism, against oppression, against the general move that you might say this 21st century is taking in so-called civilized countries against gay rights, against religious freedom, against the other, against outsiders.
The only thing that you and I have in common, Mr. Creedy, is that we're both about to die.
It's very sort of complex, the story of V for Vendetta, because on one hand you have like the lead character who is very altruistic and thinks he can bring about great change, you know, within the government by making the people come together and making them realise how the government has, you know, somehow got it out of control because they're giving them their sort of bread and circuses every day. But then, you know, he has this great moral ambiguity, which is, on the other hand, he has this murderous vendetta about everyone who's ever done anything wrong to him.
V is the hero, but he's not always good, and he sometimes does things that you can't possibly like because he's vengeful. Because of that, it sort of taints his political idealism.
Beneath this mask, there is more than flesh. Beneath this mask, there is an idea, Mr. Creedy.
It's a rough movie. It deals with a character who is a terrorist, and he is an uncompromising character. I mean, he wants to fulfill his agenda, which is to get back at the people that have harmed him and, in his feeling, harmed society.
He's a pretty complex man. One side of him is he's been imprisoned and tortured and abused, mentally and physically abused, and then burnt in fire. So that has created a vengeful angel, if you like.
One thing I didn't want to do is, and it harks back to, I guess, other superhero movies, is you always, at some point, the mask always comes off, which is good, but it's also like a bit of a cinematic cheat sometimes. I thought it might be good to, for once, play against audience expectation.
Right at the end of the film, there's a scene where Evie, Natalie's character, kisses V, and I'm interested as to how that scene will work coming after a whole film and seeing this man in the mask, and it very rarely has been touched, and then the first thing that touches it are the lips of Natalie Portman.
She has to have an arc. I mean, she goes from being this kind of normal, everyday, you know, kind of PA at a television studio to a revolutionary.
You see that she's really passive in the beginning, and she's just trying to live her life and be under the radar and be, you know, stay safe. And you can see where she comes from because of what happened with her parents. She's very afraid. I think she lives through her fear, which I think is common in this society, and also, you know, sort of reflects a lot of the sort of politicking that's happening in our world today, sort of fear-based politicking, that you should be afraid of everything.
Muslims, homosexuals, terrorists, disease-ridden degenerates. They had to go. Strength through unity.
The most interesting thing about making this movie has been the chance to say something about the political climate that we live in. It dared to ask the questions, you know, and it's not saying this is right and this is wrong, because, you know, the morality of it's very, you know, ambiguous at times, but it asks you questions that you can think about.
The themes are serious. I'm not quite sure that the treatment is as serious as that. But on the other hand, if it was as serious as that, I'm not sure that it would reach the amount of people that it's intended to reach.
I'd never seen a Hollywood script that really kind of addressed issues that are things we're all talking about at the moment. You know, whether or not the threat or perceived threat, whether it's of terrorism or of disease or of anything else, justifies a diminution in civil liberties.
The fear that everybody has about attacks, terrorist attacks in the world and a lot of the laws being brought in to counter that, sometimes quite oppressive laws. It doesn't take a great leap of imagination to see why and how a state might want a lot more control.
It's obviously not about America now or even Britain now, but it is nonetheless, it's about those very issues. And that's a marvellous thing to think that Hollywood is again able to do that.
We cannot shirk this responsibility. We must stand tall.
The political polemic in the script is what I've shot. It hasn't been watered down, and I think it's one of the great things that Warner Brothers have done, you know, that was like, you know, go off and make the film, go off and make it as it is, and there's been no editorialization.
I know this world is screwed up, believe me. I know it better than most.
Which is why I wanted to ask if there's anything I can do to help make it right.
We had a lot of talks about what it is to be political, and also the political versus the personal, and what kind of choices and you make in your life to be a political person, and how that affects your private life, and what it would be like for someone like Evie to have had her parents choose their political ideals over her, basically. And I think that, you know, for the character of Evie, that's an important place where she comes from, because you sort of wonder if we were in an oppressive government as resisting and being really active.
It is to Madame Justice that I dedicate this concerto.
I think the script does have something to say about terrorism, I suppose, and its position, which I wouldn't say that terrorism is malign, because I don't think any form of warfare is malign. I think it's all atrocious. But it's peculiar that one form of warfare should be regarded suddenly as being not on.
We talk about terrorists a lot today, and yet there's probably very little attempt to try to understand why people are terrorists.
This is a movie about a terrorist, and the hero is a terrorist. And it's a very good ethical point, because, as we all know, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter.
The idea of a terrorist who's a freedom fighter, by transplanting him into a post 9/11 world, and to bring him into a society where one can question the political philosophy of our time. It does work. I mean, it's an anti-fascist story, anti-Holocaust story.
Action! Oh my God, no! Hold your fire!
I guess the story is not unlike a resistance that would have happened with the French against the Nazis during the war, or the founding fathers of the American Revolution against the British. It's a very different story, it's very different circumstances, but it's not unlike those as well, and it's a person kind of awakening people to an idea, and then it's the people who take the idea on and make it a reality.
It's really a meditation on what happens when a government pushes people too far. It's a warning, it's a pretty ancient warning about the function of government and its responsibility towards its citizens.
Please, you don't have to go. You could let it go. We could leave here together.
That's the great thing about the Wachowski brothers, is that when they write a project, they don't clarify what the audience is seeing with a specific point of view. They leave the audience to determine how they want to interpret the material. I think that it's a politically charged movie, but it's up to the audience to figure what that means and how that affects each single person's thinking.